Before we begin this week's show, some quick parish business to attend to. The Week Unwrapped team and I are going to be appearing live on October the 5th as part of the Podcast Live Politics show in central London. For an eminently reasonable sum, you can come and watch a recording of the show where we will be joined by special guest from the For the Many podcast, LBC's Ian Dale. If you fancy coming along to that, and there are loads of other political podcasts to watch on the day as well, visit podcastlive.com, and if you use our code WEEK10 at checkout, you'll get a 10% discount on your ticket price. That's podcastlive.com and the code WEEK10. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 14th of September, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen British Parliament being suspended for 5 weeks, Donald Trump firing his national security advisor, John Bolton, or did he resign, and Apple announcing a 3-lens iPhone. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Holly Clements, Gabriel Power, and Rebecca Gilley. And starting the show this week is Holly. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the Rainbow Nation just a dream that won't come true?
To me, it's a personal decision. When you decide to go back to your home country, I think it's the best thing to do, because you cannot keep staying in a country where your life and property is not safe. And I see South Africa as an African country, is an African country in African continent. But to me, the way they treat other African people is unjustified and it's not good. And to me, when your life is not safe in a country, the best thing you can do is to go back to your home country. No place like home.
A vox pop from a Nigerian citizen on ECNA. Holly, why did you play us that?
So there's been a wave of xenophobic attacks in South Africa, leaving 12 people dead, looting, businesses destroyed, rioting. Nigeria have started repatriating hundreds of their citizens. It's not the first time it's happened. There were kind of big riots in 2008, 2015, 2017, and not necessarily the most deadly in terms of numbers, but the timing has raised big questions about South Africa's reputation on an international scale. So last week was the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, and they're kind of trying to thrash out this African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And South Africa's just come under fire during this very vital moment when people kind of see it as a big economic powerhouse.
And so you call them xenophobic attacks. So this is native South Africans physically attacking Africans from other parts of the continent who have come to set up businesses in South Africa.
And the wording has been troubling, I think, for different people. So some leaders are saying it's not xenophobic, it's just crime. But that kind of marginalises the experience of the migrants who are being targeted. So others call it Afrophobic, which is specifically against other African people. There's this kind of theory that all African people should feel this oneness as kind of this, they've come from the same continent, so they should all have each other's backs. But
how coordinated were these attacks? Because you say that they've had worse ones in the past, and presumably they're not government sanctioned, even if you detect an element of corruption in the police.
Yeah, I don't think sanctioned is the right word, but the rhetoric that some leaders use, I think you could trace it back to that. And it comes at a time when there's very high unemployment, highest for 10 years, GDP's kind of falling. It's not a great time for probably the people that are involved in the attacks, and migrants have been used as the scapegoat.
Gabriel, what does this tell us about the direction South Africa is heading in?
It's a country that's kind of torn ideologically when it comes to immigration. For instance, Ramaphosa this week, the leader of South Africa, said that he called for an end to the violence and said that South Africans should remember the efforts made by other African nations in ending apartheid in the country. And, you know, so kind of African unity was very much his message. But then the ANC, African National Congress, his party, issued a statement saying that, calling for an end to the attacks, but then added that law-abiding citizens are understandably sick of those who are breaking the moral fibre of our society by turning our kids into prostitutes and drug addicts, which is that's so inflammatory. That's not going to extinguish any fires.
I mean, it comes presumably, though, Rebecca, from an economic inequality, doesn't it? South Africa borders countries that have an economy significantly less stable than their own.
Yeah, and so, I mean, as Gabe was just saying there, the ANC has really tried to have its cake and eat it by trying to position itself as this, party of Pan-Africanism. But at the same time, they have said openly, they've blamed South Africa's economic problems on migrants coming from other parts of Africa and, sort of taking jobs, taking money away from the native population. They have really fanned the flames of what's now breaking out in this extremist violence. And one reason that we're hearing about it now, when, as you said earlier, Olly, it has happened before, is that other African nations are taking measures in response. I mean, Nigeria boycotted the economic summit, and Tanzania's national airline has cancelled flights to South Africa, saying that it's too dangerous.
I guess the equivalent would be, Italy cancelling flights to Britain. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary, isn't it?
There's definitely a big statement from other countries and just general public in other countries kind of rallying around embassies, and there's more protest by the general public. It's not just a diplomatic issue.
What's the reaction, though, in South Africa? Are people ashamed that these protests have taken place? Or does it speak to what a lot of people are obviously feeling, that, Africans from other African countries are coming to our country and making a problem?
It's almost like a question you could ask in the UK as well about Brexit. Sorry to bring the Brexit word up, but I guess it's a worldwide issue. Is migration and the exploitation of this idea that it's all the migrants' fault for every kind of ill that's happening in society. So again, I think it's divided. I'm sure a lot of people are ashamed to see that happen on their streets, and whereas some people might wish for those migrants to get the hint and go home, as they might say.
I mean, it's the involvement of the police that Holly hinted at earlier, which makes this perhaps a more distinctly African story than a European one, isn't it? I've got a quote here from the Johannesburg Metro Police Department Chief David Tembe. Talking to BBC's Eyewitness News, he said, "I think this, the destroying and looting of the shops and so on, is pure criminality because some of the shops that were burned did not belong to the foreigners, it belonged to South Africans."
I mean, I think that might have just been the fact that it's quite hard to target looting and rioting with pinpoint precision.
But the implication is, had they belonged to foreigners, we, the police, wouldn't be so bothered. It wouldn't be pure criminality.
Yeah, it's another way of trying to kind of simplify the problem and try and turn it into one of, just general disorder instead of this strong undercurrent of Afrophobia, which I just think, you said it's more specifically an African problem than a European one in this instance. And I think that is true. And one of the things that's so sad is that it's happened. This is happening, a week after the death of Robert Mugabe, who, setting aside all of the awful things that he did as leader of Zimbabwe, was seen as one of the central figures of this post-colonial Pan-African ideology, that all of Africa had suffered from colonialism and exploitation. There needed to be a new dawn where African nations, stood by one another and supported one another
and
economically.
And Zimbabwe did support South Africans during apartheid too.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think it's so sad that the South African government has exacerbated existing tensions to try and distract from its own economic failures. And now we're seeing this spring up in African on African violence, which is just a really sad thing to see.
There's also a vicious cycle of South Africa really needing investment to boost their economy, but events like this is going to put people off. So they're not doing themselves any favours by kind of exploiting the migrant idea.
And will there be an effect on tourists as well, people going to South Africa on holiday?
Absolutely. South Africa has the second largest tourism sector in Africa after Morocco. This level of violence probably won't entice many foreigners to visit anytime soon.
All right. Rebecca, you're up next after this.
Order! The Prime Minister will be aware that Podcast Live Politics will return to London on Saturday, October 5th.
Indeed, I imagine people in this house will enjoy seeing Chopper's Brexit podcast and the Delling pod, whilst the honourable gentleman will no doubt enjoy seeing polling politics to see how badly he and his party are doing.
Typical Tory bluster. I believe the Prime Minister would benefit from seeing the new European podcast, UK in a Changing Europe, and to think about Ian Dale and Jackie Smith's For the Many.
Order! Whether the House wishes to see talking politics or escape Brexit with the week unwrapped, there will be plenty of room for everyone. Even the Liberal Democrats can see never mind the bar charts. And all of these podcasts are live in London on October 5th. Indeed, tickets are available now from podcastlive.com. Unlock!
OK, Rebecca, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Navigating the tricky line between honesty and shaming.
Mental health and like my own mental health is something that I used to talk to my dad about. I was drinking a lot, and that was my way of coping with feeling anxious, and it helped me to clear my head and feel like I didn't need that.
I had a book launch for my book called Mind Equals Blown. I remember just taking this photo and just not really caring, just thinking like, what's the point of anything? Should have been really excited about a big moment in my life, but I just couldn't do it.
I remember having like my first panic attack, feeling a sense of emptiness and not having anywhere that I belong to. And I don't usually talk to people about any of the things that I go through, so it was like, should I say this?
That was a clip from a promotional video for Movember 2019 entitled Man of More Words. Rebecca, what's the story?
So just to set the scene for this story is that a couple of weeks ago, US games designer Alec Hololka killed himself, and this happened a few days after he was accused of sexual abuse and other mistreatment by Zoe Quinn, who you may remember as being the game designer at the centre of the Gamergate scandal.
OK, Gamergate, yes, rings some bells, but for those of us who don't remember the detail, in a nutshell...
Basically, Zoe Quinn was at the centre of it. They use gender-neutral pronouns, made a game called Depression Quest, and there was an accusation by a former partner saying that they, Quinn, had slept with a games journalist in return for positive review. This was later shown to not have been the case, but it launched a kind of wider schism in the gaming community where a vocal subsection felt like games were being ruined by the intrusion of kind of politically correct themes like female characters being well developed, not just in the chest area, and that people like Quinn, you know, progressive left-wing feminist types were to blame and
not welcome in the gaming community.
Yeah, and then Quinn was at the centre of a massive sort of trolling campaign. But this came on the back of several other women and non-binary people in the industry coming out and talking about how they'd been assaulted or abused by powerful people within the industry. And then what's happened this week is that there's been a gigantic backlash, as you can imagine, most of it directed at Quinn. Zoe Quinn murderer was trending in the gaming community. Some alt-right blogs and, I use the term loosely, newspapers accusing them of making up all these allegations and saying basically that they had blood on their hands and they had forced him to commit suicide, even though his own sister had come out and said that he had been battling a lot of mental health issues and that he didn't bear any ill will towards any of the accusers.
OK, so this is very sad, both for his family and I suppose for Zoe as well, because having been the centre of Gamergate, which was this big furore pretty much centred on them, there they are again receiving abuse from the same kind of gaming community. But what's the repercussion for everybody else here? Why is this an important story?
One of the interesting things around this incident is summed up in an article in Wired by Laurie Penny, Gaming's Me Too Moment, the Tyranny of Male Fragility, in which she argues that basically what's been is this kind of an interesting clash between two, you know, quite popular movements, mostly being spread around on social media. One being the Me Too movement and the idea that women should speak out and directly call out men who have harassed them and made their lives difficult, both to, you know, create an atmosphere of shaming that will deter other people from acting the same way, and also to make other victims feel like they can come forward as well and that there's nothing that they should be ashamed of, but also focus on sensitivity to mental health and particularly men's mental health. We just had Suicide Awareness Day this week as well. And so it's the clash between these two ideas. And Laurie Penny makes the argument that women are essentially being threatened or blackmailed into keeping the stories to themselves because we as a society still care more about men's feelings. And the idea that, oh, well, you know, it's worse to upset a man by telling him something that, by publicly speaking about their misbehaviour than it is to just keep it to yourself.
Holly, is that right? Should women who are going online to name and shame someone who they say abused them take on board the possible consequences of that allegation or not?
I think there's lots of sides to it, and I think it's kind of offensive to say that mental health makes someone an abuser. Like, you get people that have got mental health issues and they're not going around assaulting women. Like, that's not definitely the reason why. Like, you make that decision. I think people need to own up to that. There is also this argument that the accused shouldn't be named until they've been convicted, which is something Cliff Richard's kind of campaigning for, which you can see it's kind of wrecked his life just being accused, and the internet makes it so easy for anyone to do that. But then you get the drawback of other women not coming forward if they don't know someone's been accused. Zoe Quinn was inspired to come forward because somebody else had come forward with a similar allegation about a different man in gaming. So maybe you do need these big public displays of women telling the world that it's happened for other people to come forward and have that confidence to do so.
So if you're about to make an allegation of a man who has abused you, should you be thinking whether or not they may commit suicide after you've made that allegation? Should that be on your mind?
Not from my point of view. If you genuinely that's happened to you, no.
This is the thing, is that the idea that you're innocent till proven guilty is one thing, but if you are the victim, then obviously you know if the person is guilty. So, the idea that you shouldn't share your experience, well, if it happened to you, of course, it's true. That's different from other people making accusations. But then the thing that really stopped me in my tracks thinking about this is that my initial reaction, as a woman, as a feminist, etc., was to think, yeah, of course they should come forward and say whatever. It's not their responsibility. The consequences of that story coming out to the alleged perpetrator is not their responsibility. If they lose their job, which in Holoca's case did happen, his company severed ties with him. But I was thinking earlier this summer there was a story, Carlos Meza, who's a progressive activist who makes a series of videos for Vox. He became the target of a right-wing YouTuber with a really huge following and then was subjected to horrible abuse and trolling. The sort of progressive take on this story was that it was very wrong of this YouTuber to, pick on him because he knew he had this gigantic fandom who would harass him. And then I started thinking, well, is it really that different? I mean, Zoe Quinn also has a huge following, on the more progressive side of the gaming community. And they obviously also, in the exact same way, surely must have known that there would be consequences from this tweet and that their own followers might then go after the alleged perpetrator.
I mean, regardless of the debate that's being had, though, and the ethics that are being discussed and the individuals involved, it's the technology that's facilitating it, isn't it, Gabriel? At the end of this, is it the fault of individuals using that technology, or is it the fault of Reddit and 4chan and Twitter for providing a platform for that kind of mob mentality to occur?
It's a case-by-case basis, really, because what Rebecca's talking about, which is Carlos Meza, the Vox journalist, getting abused online by Stephen Crowder, the Canadian right-wing talk show host, who I'm not a big fan of. So Meza actually came out on Twitter, and his lengthy tirade against Crowder and his abuse was actually more targeted at YouTube, saying, why isn't YouTube doing anything about this? Why isn't it, if it has all these algorithms in place that can, automatically demonetize videos that have things about mental health or mentions of LGBT issues, then why can't it filter out horrible abuse like that? So that is certainly a tech issue, but I feel like that's a fairly long way off what we're talking about with Quinn and Holoka, because that obviously is just about mental health, really. That's a kind of like personal thing as opposed to like bringing in the kind of corporate side of it.
And we got into this story, Rebecca, you brought us that clip of the promo for Movember this year, by talking about male mental health. Some people clearly feel, Holly, that the empowerment of men to discuss their mental health is possibly at the expense of everyone else's mental health being considered, and particularly, I guess, the effects of public shaming on someone's mental health.
Yes, I don't think there's anything wrong with men encouraged to talk about their mental health. That's great. I think it's more if they've done something terrible like rape or sexual abuse, there comes a point where you have to put the woman or the victim's point of view and mental health above her abuser. I can't see how we should argue it any other way. But yes, there is this social shaming. I guess you wouldn't have the Me Too movement without the internet, without social media. So it's got its positives, but it does come with millions of people reading a post that you've written about your ex or all the trolling that goes with it, which is definitely a big danger for mental health.
And however liberated you might feel, Gabriel, writing something about something that happened to you, I guess you've got to be aware now that public shame might be heading your way too. You're putting yourself in the line of fire.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's I don't know. I'm quite torn on it generally because I feel like it promotes a really ugly brand of vigilante justice online, but it also, I don't know. And I also, you hear from a lot of people that have indulged in public shaming that they later regret it or they regret doing so. So maybe there should be some sort of cooling off period, personally mandated. But yeah, at the same time, the Me Too movement may not have happened. So it's a difficult one to answer, really.
I mean, the Me Too movement, I guess, Rebecca, finally on this, could have happened with all of the perpetrators having been anonymised, actually. I mean, the point was that all of these women had had similar experiences at the hands of powerful men. The police could investigate the specifics without outing those people as individuals.
The thing is that a lot of these allegations, they sort of occupy a grey area where the victims obviously feel that they either weren't serious enough to necessitate a criminal proceeding or that they wouldn't be taken seriously by police. You know, sexual assault and rape are one thing, but a lot of the Me Too allegations in different industries, and including the gaming industry, have been more like warnings to other women in the industry, and indeed warnings to male and female bosses who might want to employ these people, saying, you know, you're not going to go to the police and say, oh, they implied that if I didn't sleep with them, I wouldn't, get to work on this game, probably wouldn't go anywhere in the legal system. But it's a way of alerting other people to this misbehavior and kind of hoping that, in quite a biblical way, that this public shaming might have a kind of healthy corrective effect on the industry as a whole. But as we see from this story and from several other stories like it, and once you've unleashed this kind of allegation, it's very hard to control the consequences.
Okay, one last story to come. Gabriel, you're up next after this. And so, finally this week, it's Gabriel. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
When it comes to hurricane predictions, the pen is not mightier than the computer.
You've probably heard of the butterfly effect. It's the idea that a butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world, and that movement can have unforeseen effects across the planet. This illustrates why it's so hard to predict a hurricane's path, because there are too many independent variables and too much data. Any tiny errors or omissions in the predictive model can corrupt the algorithm. It's called chaos theory. It means that there is so much information that the precise movements are impossible to predict.
That was a clip from YouTube channel Cheddar entitled, Why Are Hurricanes So Hard to Predict? Gabriel, why are hurricanes so hard to predict?
Well, for a number of reasons. This week, Anthony Wimmers, a scientist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Satellite Studies.
How hard have you been practicing that?
Unveiled Deep Micronet, which is an AI creation of his, which appears to substantiate claims that AI is the way forward when it comes to predicting weather patterns, using deep learning neural networks to find existing patterns in data sets. And this is fairly important for two reasons. On a more serious note, you have climate change increasing the randomness of weather events. Like the US in the last couple of years has had 14 what would be called major events of costing over $1 billion in damage. So that would be obviously you combat the deadly effects of climate change and also the financial costs of climate change. And then also you have people like Donald Trump, drawing Sharpies onto maps to try and cover his tracks when it comes to accidentally telling the wrong state that they were in the path of a hurricane.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
He hasn't admitted drawing on the map with the Sharpie.
No, that is true. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this new system is a kind of continuation of a number of years of work by researchers and meteorologists and is capable of churning through tens of thousands of images and data sets of existing hurricanes or previous hurricanes to calculate exactly where they're going because of the butterfly effect that was just mentioned in that clip that we were listening to.
Okay, so we might yet have a more accurate forecasting system in the future. What's the system at the moment, Rebecca? My understanding is it's kind of the USA versus Europe.
Yeah, so they use slightly different models, focusing on slightly different things. So the US system, possibly because the US faces more extreme weather events than Europe, is focused more on shorter-term warnings, and the European system is focused more on mid-range forecasting, so like a few days to a week in advance. And so the general consensus is that the European system has been slightly more accurate in tracking some extreme weather events because they are using a higher volume of more recent data. They're drawing on a more dense collection of recent weather data. And the idea being that if, as we were talking about the butterfly effect, if when you start to make your forecast, one piece of data is missing, or you've misinterpreted one small thing about recent weather patterns, then obviously that mistake is going to have bigger and bigger ramifications until it might come to a point where you're predicting the path of a hurricane completely wrong. And we saw this in 2012 with Hurricane Sandy, where the US Weather Service initially predicted that it wouldn't make landfall in the US, and the European system correctly predicted that it would make landfall on the East Coast, which it did, with disastrous consequences. So that shows you how important this kind of technology is.
Now, Gabriel, you are half American, I believe.
I am.
Which side of your genealogy do you fall down on then? Because, do you feel like Americans listening to this should be consulting the European weather predictions rather than their own?
Yes. Because ours is, well, I say ours, Europe's is more accurate, has been for a long time.
And what does that mean for Americans? Because they're quite a proud nation. I imagine that even, the American TV networks and newspapers, which, let's be honest, is how most people listening to this would get their weather news, they're not going to go to the source, probably look at both set of predictions anyway?
Yeah, I mean, what it means for America is that they need to invest more on machine learning. As the opinion of a lot of experts, they need to start using neural networking. And
so if you aren't using this new machine learning technology, what have they been using up until now?
They usually collect observations such as temperature, wind speed, atmosphere information at pressure from weather stations and satellites, and then put it into a numerical computer model to project what the weather will be like. But the AI can just do that quicker with loads more data and basically get you a lot more specific information. They're talking about nowcasting, where you get the weather in the next 2 hours. So there's these big implications like protecting you from hurricanes, which is great. But I think there's quite interesting ones for just day-to-day people with a smartphone. You could look at your phone and see whether it's going to rain in your locality, like in the next half an hour, which would be really useful. And also things like, we don't really trust the weather at the moment, but imagine what we could do if you knew for sure that it was going to rain on Saturday. All these things that we don't really have at the moment. That is quite an exciting idea, that we would actually know the future. Like, people maybe wouldn't book their wedding for certain days, or there's all kind of implications that you don't think about.
Like, we have so much technology in our lives now, but it is weird that when it comes to the weather, there is still a lot of like squinting at the sky and being like, oh, it's raining. Oh, it said on AccuWeather or BBC that it wasn't going to rain today.
Yeah. It definitely feels like, though, that when it's incorrect is the only time when you notice it, because statistics show that it's within 5 days, it's 90% accurate.
And let's be honest, this story is only in the news at all because of Hurricane Dorian. Not to belittle that, lots of people have died. But, these events pass and people forget that the weather is a story at all.
Absolutely, but I mean, you certainly don't want a repeat of the more deadly hurricanes that have taken courses that were unpredictable, as we were talking about Sandy, but then there was also Hurricane Charlie in 2004. That took a sudden west turn early, long before meteorologists predicted that was going to happen, and it hit landfall in Florida, south of where it was supposed to, and it completely decimated the town of Charlotte Harbor, I think it was called.
And, when we're looking at the comparisons in accuracy between US and European models, we are talking about very slight differences. Obviously, both of them are, to a large extent, very accurate in predicting weather patterns. But if you think about it, a couple of hours makes all the difference of forewarning. If you're on an island that's about to be hit by a hurricane, a couple of hours of extra notice of that, it could save lives and also save a lot of damage.
And actually, might it be helpful that there's a bit of a race between these different systems of assessing the weather? The AI, the US system, the European system. Might that actually mean that people are focused on outdoing their competitors as well as just improving the technology, and we might get there quicker?
It's a bit like when we've talked about medical advances as well, like curing malaria and other horrible diseases. It's so important that we get it right. So whether that competition spurs people on or working together, collaboration, maybe you'd hope that people work together to save lives rather than just competing. And just out of curiosity, where do you all get your weather news from? I speak as someone who I don't understand why people bother caring about it at all. I'm not talking about hurricanes, but I just think I'm going to live my life regardless of whether it's raining or sunny. But explain to me. Met Office?
Yeah, straight to the source, Met Office.
Met Office website, no app? Just the website, yeah. Rebecca?
AccuWeather, but only because it's the one that's installed on my phone.
Okay, thank you. That is it from The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to the never predictable Holly Clements, Gabriel Power and Rebecca Gilley. And for some hotspots, rumblers and places of sunshine, you can discover our entire back catalogue when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week,